What started as a harmless dinner turned into the most emotionally stirring evening of my life. I thought I knew what loyalty looked like until Andrew, my husband's boss, offered me something I didn't expect and couldn't walk away from. What would you have done in my shoes? Before we dive in, tell me, from which cities are you watching us? I love seeing where everyone is from. Drop your city in the comments and let's begin. I never imagined a text message could make my hands tremble. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind where you hear your own breath echo through the house. I had just finished folding the last of the laundry when my phone lit up. The sender, Andrew, my husband's boss. Just seeing his name pop up made my heart skip, not out of fear or excitement, but pure confusion. Dinner tonight? The message read, just you and me. I'd like to talk. My treat, 7 p.m. Amalfi's. At first, I laughed to myself. Surely this had to be some kind of mistake. Why would Andrew want dinner with me? My husband Mark had mentioned him often, usually in the context of work stress or tight deadlines, but never anything personal. I reread the message a few times before replying with something vague like, "That's unexpected. May I ask what this is about?" His response came within seconds. "Nothing bad. Something I've been meaning to say. Please come." Now, I know what you might be thinking. A married woman having dinner with her husband's boss. Sounds like the setup to a scandal. But that wasn't what this was. At least not yet. I stood in front of my closet longer than I care to admit. I wasn't dressing to impress, I told myself. I was dressing to be taken seriously. Still, I chose the navy blue dress that hugged my waist just enough to feel elegant and confident. Something about Andrew's message lingered with me. The tone, the timing. I wasn't afraid. I was curious. Amalfi's was a place Mark and I had always wanted to try but never got around to. Fancy, intimate, and low-lit, the kind of restaurant with linen napkins and waiters who never let your water glass dip below half. Andrew was already seated at a small booth near the back. He stood when he saw me. "Linda," he said, offering a warm but firm handshake. "You look radiant." That wasn't a word I heard often. Not from Mark, not from anyone lately. I smiled, trying not to read into it. "You clean up well yourself," I said, easing into the leather booth across from him. We ordered wine. I let him choose. He seemed to know his way around the menu. The first few minutes of our conversation were exactly what you'd expect. Polite, surface level, filled with compliments about Mark's work and casual mentions of upcoming projects. But somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, things shifted. "I want to be honest with you, Linda," he said, setting his wine glass down and meeting my eyes. "I've noticed something." My heart paused. "Okay." "I've noticed how much of yourself you pour into others. Into Mark. Into keeping everything together behind the scenes. And yet, I see you. I see the way you move in a room, the way you listen, the way you care. You're unforgettable." The silence that followed was full and heavy. My breath caught somewhere in my throat. I was not expecting this. Not from him. Not tonight. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he added quickly. "But I needed you to know. It's been eating at me for months. I think you deserve more than you've been given." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was flattered. Another part was frozen. And somewhere deep inside, a voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "Someone sees me." "Andrew, that's a lot to say over linguine." He chuckled softly, but there was no playfulness in his eyes. Only honesty. "You're right. But I didn't invite you here to play games. I invited you here because I respect you, because I admire you, and because I want to offer you something real, not just words. There it was again, that feeling, not desire exactly, not temptation, but recognition, a sense that, for once, someone was looking past the role I played, wife, mother, caretaker, and simply seeing me. I leaned back in my seat, fingers wrapped around the stem of my wine glass. You said you wanted to offer me something. What did you mean? He nodded slowly, as if he'd rehearsed the words but was still unsure of my reaction. Freedom, he said. Not in a reckless way. I'm not asking for an affair. I'm offering you a chance to feel again, to step outside what's expected and rediscover who you are. I have a property, quiet, peaceful, upstate. No expectations, just space for a weekend. With me, if you want. Alone, if you prefer. No pressure. Just a breath. That was when I realized I hadn't taken a real breath in years. Not a deep one. Not one that made me feel anything close to alive. I looked at him, studied his face. There was no arrogance in his offer, just vulnerability, and an unexpected tenderness I never thought I'd witness in a man like him. The check came. He paid in silence, and as we stood to leave, he gently touched my arm. Whatever you decide, he said, no judgment, just know the invitation stands. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hug. But as he held the door open for me and watched me walk toward my car, I felt a shift. Something had changed, not between us, yet, but within me. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to see where that change could lead. The next morning, I woke with a weight in my chest that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was more like an ache. A kind of restlessness that started deep in my ribs and stretched all the way to my fingertips. I made coffee like I always did, 1 cup for me, 1 for Mark, and sat in the kitchen staring out the window as the steam curled up from my mug. Mark was in the shower, humming some tune off-key, completely unaware of the dinner I had the night before. And even if I had told him, what could I say? That his boss offered me freedom, a weekend in the mountains to breathe, that he looked at me not as his employee's wife, but as a woman, still alive, still burning inside, despite years of being on autopilot? No, there were no words for that. Not yet. I spent the day pretending to be busy. I rearranged the spice rack. I vacuumed twice. I answered a few emails I'd been avoiding. But no matter what I did, Andrew's voice kept echoing in my head. You deserve to feel again. It was like he'd reached into some private, forgotten part of me and turned on a light I didn't know I needed. That night, as I climbed into bed next to Mark, I felt the distance between us more than ever. Not physically, he was only inches away, but emotionally. Our conversations had become practical, our touches routine. He kissed my forehead out of habit, not passion, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd truly been seen by him. The next morning, I replied to Andrew's message. 4 words. Where is the cabin? He didn't answer right away. I waited. Hours passed. It wasn't until after dinner that my phone buzzed with a response. About 2 hours north, in the hills near Cold Spring. Quiet. Private. You'll love it. No pressure, he said. No expectations. And yet something inside me felt like I was standing at a crossroads. I could continue playing the role, devoted wife, reliable homemaker, background character in my own story, or I could follow this strange and sudden path. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag. I told Mark I was going to visit an old college friend for the weekend. He nodded absently, already halfway into his phone screen. The drive upstate was more beautiful than I expected. Rolling hills, fading leaves, and the soft amber hue of the late afternoon sun stretching over the trees like honey. I rolled the windows down just to feel the crisp air on my skin. When I arrived, I almost turned around. The cabin was stunning, not flashy or grand, just warm, simple. A small wraparound porch, a chimney puffing out gentle smoke, and the smell of pine and damp wood all around. Andrew stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking down the gravel path as I pulled in. I got out slowly, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Linda," he said, his voice low and calm, "you came." "I did," I replied, still not sure why. He smiled just a little. "Maybe you don't need to be." The inside of the cabin felt like stepping into another life. There was a fire already going, soft music playing on an old record player, and the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables coming from the kitchen. He had cooked. For me. "I thought you'd want something comforting," he said, handing me a glass of wine. "You've spent so much time giving. I figured tonight someone should give back to you." I took the glass, my fingers brushing his. It wasn't electric, but it was grounding. Warm. Real. Dinner was easy. We talked about everything and nothing. Our childhoods, books we loved, dreams we'd left behind. He didn't ask about Mark. I didn't offer. It wasn't about infidelity. It was about rediscovery. And somewhere in the middle of our second glass of wine, I realized I was laughing. Not polite chuckles. Real, head-tossed back laughter. The kind I hadn't felt in years. After dinner, we sat by the fire. The silence between us was soft, not awkward. He poured us both tea, and we sat there listening to the crackle of the flames. "Do you ever wonder," he said after a long pause, "how your life ended up the way it did? Like, you blinked, and somehow you became a version of yourself you don't quite recognize." I looked into the fire, then at him. Every single day. He didn't respond, just nodded, slowly. At one point, I leaned my head on the edge of the couch and closed my eyes. And when I felt his hand brush against mine, I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I let it stay there. His touch was gentle, not possessive, not suggestive, just present. "I don't want to make you feel pressured," he said quietly. "You can have the guest room or the couch, or I'll leave if you want to be alone. This isn't about seduction. It's about presence, permission, breathing." And in that moment, I believed him, completely. I chose the guest room, not because I didn't want him, but because I needed to sleep alone in a space where no one expected anything from me. I needed to lie in a bed and remember what it felt like to exist without apology. As I curled beneath the quilt that night, I thought about the version of myself I'd long buried under routines and responsibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I let her breathe. That night, I didn't dream of Andrew. I dreamed of myself. The sunlight filtering through the cabin window was different than at home, soft, golden, and slow, like it wasn't in any hurry to start the day. I lay there for a while under the warm quilt, my body still and strangely content. No to-do list waiting on the counter. No dishes in the sink. No one needing anything from me. Just the gentle hum of silence and the scent of pine drifting through the crack in the window. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped out onto the porch, cradling the coffee Andrew had left for me just outside the guest room door. That small gesture, a warm mug already prepared, felt more intimate than any bouquet or compliment I could remember. It wasn't showy, it was thoughtfulness. Andrew was already up, tending to something in the garden patch that stretched along the back of the cabin. He looked different in the morning light, softer, more human, less like the sharp, polished executive who commanded boardrooms and more like someone who belonged to the earth, to the stillness of this place. "Sleep okay?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. I nodded. "Better than I have in years." We didn't talk about last night. We didn't need to. There was an unspoken agreement between us. This weekend was a pause, not an escape. A chance to step outside our lives and breathe. And I was finally beginning to understand what that really meant. After breakfast, we went for a walk. The path behind the cabin wove through a line of tall oaks and into a clearing that opened like a secret. Everything was green and gold, the leaves just beginning to turn, the air crisp but not cold. I found myself laughing again, deep, relaxed laughter that caught me off guard. I couldn't remember the last time I'd walked without purpose, without a schedule or destination. "You've changed since yesterday," Andrew said quietly as we walked side by side. I turned to him, brows raised. "How do you mean?" "You're lighter," he said, like someone who took off a heavy coat and forgot they were wearing it. I didn't answer, but I felt those words settle inside me like a truth I hadn't known I needed. Maybe that's exactly what this weekend was for, not to chase something new, but to lay down something old. That afternoon we cooked together. I chopped onions while he stirred a pot of soup. We moved around each other with ease, like we'd done it 100 times before. No performance, no pretense, just comfort. As the soup simmered, I sat at the kitchen table with a journal I'd found tucked into the bookshelf. I hadn't written in years, but the words came easy now. Thoughts, questions, memories, even small, silly dreams I'd long shelved away. I wrote without judgment, without needing to be right, just honest. Andrew didn't interrupt me. He just let me be. After dinner, as the fire crackled again in the hearth, we sat in the same spots as the night before. But something felt different this time. The silence was still gentle, but charged. There was something under the surface now, something unspoken between us that neither of us had dared touch until then. I turned to him, words forming before I could stop them. "Why me?" He looked at me like he'd been waiting for that question all along. "Because you're the kind of woman people overlook," he said. "Not because you're forgettable, but because you're dependable. Steady. You carry everyone, Linda. And no one ever thinks to ask what you need. But I saw you. I watched how you listened in meetings. How you smoothed things over when Mark snapped at someone or dropped the ball. You're not loud, but you're powerful. And I couldn't ignore it." My breath caught in my throat. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to me that way, not about my looks, not about being a good wife or mother, but about me. I set down my tea and stood, unsure of what I was doing, just moving on instinct. He stood too, slowly, like he didn't want to scare the moment. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. "I don't know what it means. I just know that something in me has shifted. And I'm scared." "I am too," he said softly. "But I'm here, and you're allowed to feel whatever you're feeling." There was a pause. And then I took a step closer. And another. We didn't kiss. Not yet. Instead, I rested my forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around me. Not possessively, Not urgently, just safely. I don't know how long we stood like that. Long enough for the fire to settle into embers. Long enough for my breathing to match his. Long enough for my guard to finally fall. Later, as I lay in bed, his bed this time, I wasn't overwhelmed with guilt. I wasn't even confused. I just felt still, whole, seen. There were no decisions made that night, no promises, no declarations, but in the silence between us, something real had taken root, something honest and fragile and maybe even beautiful. And I knew, when I returned home, nothing would be quite the same again. I drove home in silence. The winding road that had once brought me to Andrew's cabin now unraveled behind me like a long exhale. My fingers gripped the steering wheel, but my mind wasn't on the road. It was on everything I felt and everything I didn't yet know how to say. The radio was off. I didn't want music. I didn't want distraction. I wanted to hold on to the quiet, because somehow in that stillness I discovered parts of myself I hadn't touched in years. I'd felt something awaken. And now, with every passing mile, I was wondering how I would bring that awakened woman back into the world I'd left just 2 days earlier. Mark was in the kitchen when I walked in. The TV was on in the other room, some sports recap humming in the background. He looked up from the fridge and gave me a smile, habitual, pleasant, but distant. "Hey," he said, "how was the visit?" "Good," I replied, hanging up my coat. "Really good." He nodded and turned back to the groceries. No follow-up, no curiosity. And just like that, I felt the full weight of what I had left and what I had returned to. It wasn't that Mark was cruel or inattentive. He just stopped seeing me somewhere along the way. Somewhere between the bills and the routines and the day-to-day survival, we'd become two people sharing a life, but not living one together. And for the first time, I couldn't unsee that. Over the next few days, I moved through our home like someone returning to a memory rather than a life. I folded laundry. I cooked dinner. I answered emails. But I also stared out windows longer than usual. I journaled every night. I found myself replaying the sound of Andrew's voice, the way he listened, the way he noticed. He didn't call. He didn't text. He gave me space. And that space was the most generous thing he could have offered. It let me sort through the swirl of emotion without pressure, without guilt, without anyone demanding an answer from me. But still, he was there. In my mind, in the quiet, in the reflection of who I had become when I was with him. A week later, I ran into him at a charity dinner Mark had insisted we attend. It was a formal event, full of people who smiled too tightly and drank too quickly. I wore a black dress I hadn't pulled out in years, one that hugged my waist and reminded me, subtly but confidently, that I was still a woman, not just someone's wife. Andrew saw me from across the room, and in that moment nothing existed but the weight of his gaze. He didn't come rushing over. He didn't steal me away. He just smiled, slow, respectful, and knowing. Later that evening, as I slipped away to the balcony for air, I heard the door open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. "You look like yourself tonight," he said softly. I turned then. "And what does that look like?" He paused, his eyes searching mine. "Like a woman who remembers her own power." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The space between us spoke volumes. There was no tension, no urgency, just awareness. He took a step closer, not to touch, but to be near. "I meant what I said, Linda. That weekend wasn't just for you. It was for me too. You reminded me of something I had lost." I nodded. My voice was a whisper. "What happens now?" He looked down for a moment, then back up. "That's for you to decide. I'm not here to complicate your life, but if there's a door you're ready to walk through, I'll be on the other side." We didn't kiss, not even then, because what we had wasn't about passion in the way people assume. It was about recognition, resonance, a reflection of who we were beneath the lives we'd settled into. I went back inside that night with a full heart and a clear mind. Over the next few weeks, I made small changes. I started painting again. I took morning walks, alone. I read books that fed me instead of numbing me. And eventually, I sat down with Mark and spoke truths I had buried for years. Not cruel ones, not accusations, just honesty about what I needed, what I missed, who I was becoming. And it wasn't easy. Nothing real ever is. But I knew this. I couldn't go back to being invisible. Not now, not ever again. As for Andrew, he remained patient, steady. Occasionally we'd talk, short conversations, thoughtful check-ins, but he never pushed. One Saturday morning, months later, I found myself driving north again. The air was cooler, the leaves had long since fallen, and the sky held the soft promise of snow. When I pulled up to the cabin, he was there on the porch, mug in hand, looking down the path like he'd always been waiting. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the car. He didn't ask any questions. He just opened the door. And I walked in, not as someone who needed to be rescued, but as someone who had finally chosen herself. Whatever came next, I knew this much. I was no longer living for permission. I was living in truth.